Picture the desert at night. The temperature drops, and the wind carries whispers across dunes that stretch endlessly under a tapestry of stars. There are no cities here now. No lights. Only the quiet hum of ancient silence, broken occasionally by the shifting of sand that covers what was once stone, what was once home, what was once kingdom. This is the threshold, the place where history dissolves into myth, and myth into something older still. A place where the map ends and memory begins to fail, where the ancients walked paths we can no longer trace, spoke languages we will never hear, and raised monuments to gods whose names have been swept away like dust. Tonight, we journey backward, not just centuries, but millennia. Not to the empires you learned about in school, but to the ones that came before them, the ones that left no scrolls. No pottery shards with convenient inscriptions. No convenient timelines for textbooks. These are the forgotten kingdoms. The ones that existed before Egypt became Egypt. Before Mesopotamia earned its name. Before the first map was ever drawn. They rose in silence, flourished in shadow, and vanished so completely that even their ruins have ruins. The stars above this desert are the same stars they saw. The constellations have barely shifted. If you listen closely, if you quiet the modern noise in your mind, you might hear something, not voices exactly, but the echo of something vast and patient. The memory of a world that built itself, lived fully, and disappeared without asking permission to be remembered. Close your eyes. Let the night settle around you. We're about to walk through doorways that no longer exist, into halls that have no walls, across kingdoms that sleep beneath your feet, waiting in the dark. Long before cartographers drew the world was already full. Humans did not wait for history to begin. They built, they gathered, they created complex societies in places we now assume were always empty. But emptiness is often just forgetfulness, wearing a geographic mask. Oral traditions, those fragile threads of memory passed from elder to child across countless generations, speak of cities swallowed by lakes, of kings who ruled river valleys that no longer flow. Geologists have begun to listen. They've found riverbeds beneath the Sahara, lake shores where now only sand exists, coastlines drowned under modern seas. What if the oldest stories aren't myth? What if they are compressed history, the last breath of testimony from those who watched their world change beyond recognition? Consider this. The Aboriginal Australians possess oral histories that accurately describe coastlines from over 10,000 years ago, coastlines now submerged beneath the ocean. They speak of mountains that are now islands, of hunting grounds now beneath the waves. Science recently confirmed these stories, finding the drowned landscapes exactly where the songs said they would be. If one culture can remember 10 millennia, what have others remembered and then lost? What kingdoms existed in the vast stretches of time before writing, when memory was the only library and the eldest voice the only archive? The earth itself becomes the record. Sediment cores pulled from ancient lake beds reveal pollen from forests that grew where deserts now reign. Satellite imaging shows ghost rivers' vast waterways that once carved through continents, now invisible except from space. Ground-penetrating radar has begun to reveal structures beneath jungles and sands, settlements no one knew to look for. These were not primitive campsites. Some were sophisticated, organized, architectural. They traded across vast distances, tracked celestial movements, and developed technologies we're only beginning to understand. And then, for reasons as varied as the cultures themselves, they ended. Climate shifted, waters rose or vanished, populations moved or perished. And the maps, when they were finally drawn centuries or millennia later, showed only emptiness where kingdoms once stood. Meanwhile, science offers an explanation that is both comforting and terrifying in its scale. These civilizations did not simply vanish, they were buried, slowly, methodically, by the single most powerful architect on Earth, climate. Between roughly 15,000 and 5,000 years ago, North Africa experienced what geologists call the African humid period. The Sahara, that vast furnace of sand we know today, was green. Rivers flowed through it. Lakes some the size of modern countries dotted its interior. Rain fell regularly. Grasslands supported megafauna, elephants, giraffes, hippos, and humans thrived. Archaeological evidence paints a picture of vibrant communities, fishing villages along lake shores, herders moving vast cattle herds across savannas, artists carving petroglyphs of boats and animals into rock faces that now bake under a merciless sun. These were not wandering nomads clinging to survival. These were cultures with leisure time, artistic traditions, and enough stability to mark their presence permanently into stone. Then, gradually, the climate shifted. The monsoons that had watered the region began to fail. Lakes shrank and disappeared. Rivers became seasonal, then dry. The green turned brown, then gold, then the pale, lifeless white of sand. The people moved. They followed the water to the Nile, to the coasts, to the few remaining fertile pockets. But their cities, their monuments, their homes, these remained. And the desert, patient and thorough, began its work of burial. In some places, this happened so slowly that the inhabitants had time to adapt, to relocate, to carry their knowledge with them. In others, the change was swift enough that entire settlements were abandoned mid-use, preserved beneath the advancing dunes like insects in amber. This pattern repeats across the globe. In the Middle East, across Central Asia, throughout regions where minor shifts in temperature or rainfall transformed paradise into wasteland. How many kingdoms fell not to war, not to conquest, but simply to the slow turning of the planet's climate gears? How many are still out there, beneath sand, waiting in the dark for someone to remember they existed at all? Centuries earlier, before the deserts claimed the land, rivers were the arteries of civilization. Where water flowed, people gathered. And where people gathered in sufficient numbers, complexity emerged. We know the famous river cultures, Egypt along the Nile, Mesopotamia between the Tigris and Euphrates. But these were not the first. They were simply the ones that lasted long enough to be written down. There were others, nameless now. Their language is extinct, their cities crumbled or buried, their peoples absorbed into later migrations. But they existed. And in their time, they were just as real, just as convinced of their own permanence. The Niger River, snaking through West Africa, shows evidence of early complex societies that predate the great kingdoms we know by thousands of years. Settlements with planned layouts, with specialized labor, with long-distance trade networks. But their names have been lost. The oral traditions that might have preserved them were interrupted by later upheavals, by colonialism, by the simple entropy of time. In the eastern Sahara, where rivers once branched from the Nile or formed their own systems, there are faint traces of similar complexity. Stone circles, burial sites with grave goods suggesting hierarchy, fishing equipment sophisticated enough to suggest permanent settlements rather than nomadic camps. The Indus Valley civilization is famous, but its own origins remain mysterious. Before Harappa and Mohenjo-Daro, were there earlier river cultures along tributary systems now dried or diverted? Satellite imaging suggests yes. Structures beneath the sands, alignments in the landscape that hint at purposeful construction. These river peoples would have known the rhythm of floods, the pattern of seasons. Their lives would have been dictated by water's presence or absence. They would have developed flood prediction, irrigation, storage. They would have told stories about the rivers, perhaps worshipped them as living gods. And when the rivers died, shifted course, dried up, were drowned by rising seas at their deltas, the civilizations built upon them died too, leaving behind only whispers, only questions. Only the faintest suggestion that here, once, people gathered in great numbers. and built something worth calling a kingdom, even if we no longer know what they called it themselves. Here is something that should make you pause. Deep in the heart of the modern Sahara Desert, in regions where rain might not fall for decades, where temperatures routinely exceed 120 degrees Fahrenheit, archaeologists have found carvings of boats, elaborate boats, boats with passengers, boats clearly designed for open water navigation. These are not crude sketches. They're detailed engravings, showing hull designs, rigging, crews. They're carved into rock faces now surrounded by nothing but sand for hundreds of miles in every direction. The conclusion is inescapable. When these images were made, there was water here, not seasonal pools, not shallow wadis that filled briefly after rare rains, but permanent, navigable bodies of water large enough to require sophisticated watercraft. Scientists have confirmed this. Lake Megachad, as they call it, once covered an area larger than the Caspian Sea. It was over 600 feet deep in places. Multiple river systems fed it, and around its shores, communities developed that depended on it entirely. They fished. They traded across its waters. They developed boat-building traditions that, if they had survived, might have rivaled anything Egypt produced along the Nile. But Lake Megachad died. Over centuries, it shrank. Its fish species went extinct. Its shoreline communities dispersed. Today, Lake Chad, its tiny remnant, is a shadow of a shadow, barely a puddle in comparison. And those boats carved into desert cliffs are monuments to a world so drastically different from the present that it feels almost alien. A reminder that the Earth's face is not constant, that where you see wasteland, there might once have been paradise, and that civilizations that seemed permanent can vanish so completely that only art remains to prove they understood water. As the climate shifted across millennia, another possibility emerges, one that mainstream archaeology has only recently begun to seriously consider. What if the urge to build in stone, to create permanent monuments, is older than civilization itself? What if the first architects emerged not from cities, but from something that preceded cities entirely? Göbekli Tepe in Turkey rewrote the timeline. Dated to around 9,500 BCE, it's a massive stone temple complex built by people who, according to previous models, should not have been capable of such work. They were hunter-gatherers, pre-agricultural, yet they carved massive T-shaped pillars, transported multi-ton stones, and created a site that clearly held ritual significance. But Göbekli Tepe might not even be the beginning. In the Sahara, at a site called Nabda Playa, stone circles and megalithic alignments date to approximately 7,000 BC, possibly earlier. These weren't simple markers. They tracked celestial events. They incorporated complex geometric relationships. They suggested organized labor and, more mysteriously, a reason to create something permanent. Who were these builders? We call them prehistoric, but that term obscures more than it reveals. They had knowledge. They had purpose. They had, almost certainly, traditions passed down through generations, traditions that required memory, teaching, apprenticeship. What's haunting is the gap between these early stone monuments and the rise of the civilizations we know. There are thousands of years of human activity that left far less evidence because it wasn't carved in stone, wasn't baked into pottery, wasn't preserved in metal. Were there kingdoms in those lost millennia? Organized societies that built in wood and clay and organic materials that have since rotted away? Did they rise and fall multiple times, each collapse erasing the memory of what came before? The stones that survive, these megalithic enigmas scattered across continents, might be the exception, not the rule. The rare moments when ancient peoples chose to build in materials that could outlast memory itself. Messages in a bottle, sent forward through time, from architects whose names we will never know. But another force was at work, one even more dramatic than the slow encroachment of sand. Water, in its own way, was rewriting the world, not through drought, but through catastrophic abundance. At the end of the last ice age, roughly 12,000 to 8,000 years ago, the planet underwent a transformation so profound it's difficult to imagine. Massive ice sheets that had covered entire continents began to melt. The water had to go somewhere. It went into the oceans. Sea levels rose, not gradually, but in pulses. Events called meltwater pulse 1A and 1B saw ocean levels jump by meters in mere centuries, sometimes even faster. Coastlines that had been stable for thousands of years were suddenly submerged. Islands became shoals. Valleys became straits. And any civilization that had built itself along those coasts faced a choice: retreat or drown. Most wisely retreated. But retreat means abandonment. And abandonment, when combined with rising seas, means permanent loss. The cities, ports, fishing villages, trading centers, anything built on the old coastlines, now lies beneath 100, 200, sometimes 400 feet of water. We have found some of them. Submerged ruins off the coasts of India, Japan, the Mediterranean. Stone structures that clearly show human construction, now encrusted with marine growth, inhabited by fish instead of people. Each discovery prompts the same question. If we found this by accident, what else is down there? The Black Sea event is particularly dramatic. Around 5,600 BCE, the Mediterranean, swollen with meltwater, breached a natural dam and poured catastrophically into what was then a freshwater lake. The Black Sea rose rapidly, flooding thousands of square miles of shoreline. If people lived there, and evidence suggests they did, they would have witnessed an apocalypse. The flood myths that persist across cultures in this region might not be myth at all, but the traumatic memory of real inundation. These were not empty lands. They were prime real estate coastal zones with access to fishing, trade routes, moderate climates. If anything, they would have been more densely populated than inland regions. And now they're gone, along with everyone who lived there, everyone who built there, everyone who might have been developing something remarkable before the waters came. Meanwhile, in Egypt, where we think we know the story, there's another chapter hidden beneath the waves. The Nile Delta, that fertile fan of distributaries spreading into the Mediterranean, is famous for its role in Egyptian civilization. But the delta we see today is not the delta of prehistory. 10,000 years ago, the Nile's mouth looked different. The coastline extended farther north. The river channels followed different paths. And in those now drowned regions, there may have been cultures that predated dynastic Egypt entirely. Underwater archaeology off the Egyptian coast has revealed structures, pottery, and artifacts in submerged zones that suggest settlement. Nothing conclusive, yet nothing that screams lost civilization, but enough to make archaeologists wonder. The sediment is thick. Visibility is poor. Excavation underwater is exponentially more difficult and expensive than on land. We've barely scratched the surface, literally. Consider this. If the earliest Egyptians emerged from indigenous populations already living in the Nile Valley and Delta, where exactly did those indigenous populations come from? Did they migrate from the drying Sahara? Possibly. Did they have their own complex cultures before the pharaohs unified the land? Almost certainly. But those pre-dynastic cultures remain shadowy. We have tantalizing hints: pottery styles, burial practices, early agriculture, but no cities, no writing, no king lists carved in stone. It's entirely possible that significant settlements existed on the delta's northern fringe, in zones now submerged, and that these were the incubators for what would later become Egyptian civilization. The same pattern likely repeats at other major deltas worldwide: the Tigris-Euphrates Delta, the Indus, the mouths of Chinese rivers. Anywhere water met sea, there would have been abundance, and abundance attracts settlement. And when the seas rose, those settlements were erased with a thoroughness that land-based destruction could never match. Water is both giver and taker. It nourishes, but it also drowns. And for the kingdoms unlucky enough to be built at sea level during a time of melting ice, the taking was total. Here's a ghost story that happens to be true. Just offshore from modern Alexandria, beneath the Mediterranean's turquoise waters, lies the ancient city of Heracleion Thonis. For centuries, it was considered myth a city, mentioned in ancient texts but never found. Historians assumed it was legend, exaggeration, or metaphor. Then, in 2000, archaeologist Frank Gaudio's team found it, 12 meters underwater, perfectly preserved in some areas, as if it had simply decided to sleep rather than die. Heracleion Thonis was Egypt's main port before Alexandria was built. Ships from across the Mediterranean and beyond would have anchored here, trading goods, exchanging ideas, bringing foreign gods to Egyptian shores. The city was wealthy, cosmopolitan, and by all accounts, magnificent. But something happened, possibly an earthquake, possibly soil liquefaction caused by the Nile's flooding, possibly a tsunami. The exact mechanism is still debated, but the result was undeniable. The city sank. Gradually or catastrophically, it slipped beneath the sea, and over centuries, sediment covered it. Memory faded. It became legend. Then it became forgotten, even as legend. Now, divers swim through its temples. They find colossal statues of gods and pharaohs lying in the silt. They recover perfectly preserved ships, their hulls intact after more than 2 millennia underwater. They navigate streets that once bustled with merchants and sailors from a dozen cultures. It's a reminder. If an entire major city can vanish so completely that its existence becomes doubtful, what else have we lost? How many Heracleions are still out there, still sleeping, waiting for someone to ask the right questions and look in the right place? The Mediterranean alone has dozens of known submerged sites, and those are just the ones we found. The ocean is vast. Our technology is improving, but the ratio of what we've searched to what remains unexplored is humbling. The underwater world may hold more history than all the museums on land combined. But not all lost kingdoms drowned or were buried. Some simply chose, or perhaps never had the chance to write anything down. And in a world where history is often equated with written history, this silence is a death sentence for memory. Writing is a relatively recent invention. The earliest true writing systems, Sumerian cuneiform, Egyptian hieroglyphs, emerged around 3200 BCE. Before that, for the vast majority of human existence, there was no writing. There were symbols, certainly. Cave paintings, carved notches that might have counted days or tracked herds, but nothing that could convey complex narratives, laws, histories. This means that for thousands of years of complex human society, nothing was recorded in a way we can directly read. No king lists, no chronicles, no historical accounts. Entire civilizations rose, reached sophistication, and fell without leaving a single sentence behind. We know they existed through what they built and what they left in the ground. Tools, structures, burial sites. But we don't know what they called themselves, what languages they spoke, what myths they told around their fires, what crises they faced, what triumphs they celebrated. Imagine being them. Imagine living in a society with social hierarchies, specialized roles, trade networks, and artistic traditions. Imagine it being as real and immediate to you as your own world is now. And then imagine that 5,000 years later, you are not remembered. Not because you failed or were conquered, but because you never learned to write. This is the fate of countless pre-literate cultures. Their silence is not evidence of primitiveness. It's simply evidence of different choices, different technologies. Oral cultures can be incredibly sophisticated, maintaining complex genealogies, legal systems, and histories through memorized recitation. But oral traditions are fragile. They require continuous transmission. Break the chain through disease, conquest, or cultural disruption, and the memory dies. So when we speak of lost kingdoms, we must understand, some were not lost by sand or sea. They were lost by silence. They existed fully, vividly, consequentially, and then they were simply forgotten, as if they never were. As the centuries turned, another question emerges from the shadows of Egypt's own prehistory. The pyramids are famous, rightfully so. But before the pyramids, before the pharaohs, before the unified kingdoms, someone was already building in stone, already shaping massive blocks, already developing techniques that would later seem almost miraculous. Recent geological surveys of the Giza Plateau and surrounding areas have identified structures and earthworks that predate the Old Kingdom by potentially thousands of years. Quarry marks that don't match later Egyptian styles. Foundation work that seems over-engineered for what stands above it. Erosion patterns on the Sphinx that some researchers argue could only have formed through prolonged exposure to water that hasn't. Tea existed in that region since well before dynastic times. The mainstream consensus is careful, conservative. These interpretations are debated, but the questions persist. Who was working stone in the Nile Valley 7,000, 8,000, perhaps even 10,000 years ago? Were they indigenous people who later became Egyptians? Were they migrants from the drying Sahara, bringing their own architectural traditions? Think of them. Master stoneworkers who understood geometry, weight distribution, and astronomy well enough to align structures with celestial bodies. People who organized labor forces, who trained apprentices, who passed down knowledge through generations. They would have had names, languages, stories, and yet they remain anonymous. The builders before the builders, the first architects of Africa's greatest monuments. This pattern isn't unique to Egypt. Worldwide, there are monuments that predate the civilizations we associate with their regions. Standing stones in Scotland, older than Stonehenge. Earthworks in the Americas that push back the timeline of complex society. In each case, we face the same mystery. Sophisticated construction emerging from supposedly primitive peoples, then fading or evolving into the cultures we do recognize. Perhaps civilization doesn't progress linearly. Perhaps it rises, falls, and rises again, with each iteration building on half-remembered knowledge from the last. And perhaps the first builders, the true first, are so far back in time that we'll only ever glimpse them through the stones they left behind. Centuries earlier, while ice still gripped the northern latitudes, the Sahara was undergoing its own transformation. The African humid period had begun, and with it came an opportunity. Rain fell, rivers formed, and life abundant, diverse, exuberant life exploded across a landscape we now consider one of Earth's most inhospitable places. This wasn't marginal existence. Archaeological sites from this period show permanent settlements, large-scale cattle herding, and artistic traditions that suggest leisure time and cultural complexity. At sites like Gabbero in Niger, excavators found elaborate burials, including the El Kide people, tall, robust individuals buried with grave goods, their remains suggesting a well-nourished population with low rates of violence. They lived beside lakes that no longer exist. They fished species now extinct from the region. They created pottery decorated with wavy lines that might represent water, the most precious element of their world. And they carved into rock surfaces, leaving behind thousands of images: giraffes, elephants, crocodiles, hippopotami, and humans engaged in daily life. Some of these petroglyphs show communal activities, dances, hunts, ceremonies. Others are more mysterious, geometric patterns, possible astronomical observations, symbols whose meanings are lost. Together, they paint a picture of cultures that had time and reason to create art, that valued representation and remembrance. As the humid period waned and the climate dried, these cultures faced existential pressure. The lakes shrank. The grasslands turned to scrub. The megafauna died off or migrated. And the people had to choose: stay and adapt to increasingly harsh conditions, or leave in search of more reliable water. Most left. Some moved toward the Nile, potentially bringing with them the knowledge that would seed Egyptian civilization. Others moved south and west, contributing to the cultures that would rise along the Niger and other West African rivers. A few might have stayed, adapting to desert life, becoming the ancestors of the Tuareg and other Saharan peoples. But what they built in the green Sahara, the villages, the seasonal camps, the herding stations, these were swallowed by sand. Not quickly enough to preserve them like Pompeii, but slowly, thoroughly, leaving only the faintest traces for modern archaeologists to puzzle over. It was a kingdom without a throne, a civilization without cities. But it was real, and for thousands of years, it thrived in a place that now seems utterly hostile to human life. Here's something that should make you look up at the night sky with new respect. At Nabda Playa, in the Nubian desert of southern Egypt, there stands a stone circle. Actually, several stone circles and megalithic alignments. They date to approximately 7,000 years ago, older than Stonehenge, older than the Egyptian pyramids. But these weren't just decorative. Analysis has shown they were astronomically aligned. Specifically, they tracked the summer solstice. When the sun rose on the longest day of the year, it would align perfectly with certain stones. This wasn't accidental. It required careful observation, mathematical understanding, and deliberate planning. Why would nomadic cattle herders, because that's what mainstream archaeology tells us, they were need to track the solstice? The answer is as practical as it is profound: the summer monsoon. In this region, during the African humid period, seasonal rains were everything. They filled the playa's temporary lakes that provided water for herds. They brought the grasslands to life. Knowing exactly when the rains would come meant the difference between survival and disaster. And the people of Nabta Playa figured out that celestial movements could predict earthly events. The sky became their calendar, reliable and unchanging even as the land shifted beneath them. But there's more. Some researchers believe the stone arrangements also incorporate alignments to certain stars, particularly those in Orion's belt, which later would be incredibly significant to dynastic Egyptian religion and architecture. Is this coincidence? Or did the knowledge preserved at Nabta Playa somehow transmit forward, carried by people who migrated to the Nile as the desert advanced? We may never know for certain. But standing in that desert now, looking at stones placed with such precision by people who left no written word, no metal tools, no grand cities, you feel the weight of their intelligence. They looked at the same stars we see. They recognized patterns in the chaos, and they built something permanent to mark that understanding. They were astronomers before astronomy had a name, and their kingdom was the sky itself. But not all forgotten kingdoms fell to heat or flood. Some were erased by cold, or rather, by the ending of cold. During the last glacial maxima, roughly 26,000 to 19,000 years ago, vast ice sheets covered much of North America, Europe, and Asia. Sea levels were 400 feet lower than today. The climate was harsh, but humans persisted. And not just persisted, they created. Cave paintings from this period, like those at Lascaux and Chauvet in France, show stunning artistic sophistication. Carved figurines, musical instruments made from bone, elaborate burial practices, all evidence that even in the grip of ice, humans maintained complex cultures. But where exactly did these Ice Age people live? Some caves are known, but caves were likely ceremonial spaces, not primary dwellings. The actual settlements, the places where people spent most of their lives, would have been on the open landscape, in zones that are now radically different. As the ice retreated, it left behind a chaotic geography. Lakes formed and then drained catastrophically. River valleys carved deep into newly exposed land. Coastlines moved relentlessly inland as meltwater poured into oceans. Any settlements that existed in these zones were obliterated not by burial, but by geological violence. The collapse of glacial lakes sent megafloods tearing across continents. The Missoula floods in North America, caused by the catastrophic draining of glacial Lake Missoula, scoured entire landscapes down to bedrock. If anyone was living in the path of those waters, they and everything they built were simply erased. In Europe, the flooding of Doggerland, a vast plain that connected Britain to continental Europe, submerged what might have been one of the richest hunting grounds in the prehistoric world. Artifacts dredged up by fishing boats hint at occupation, but the full extent of human presence, there remains unknown, buried beneath the North Sea. These Ice Age cultures were not primitive survivors huddling in fear. Evidence suggests they were well adapted, knowledgeable about their environment, and capable of long-distance trade and communication. But their world was temporary in a way they couldn't have understood. When the ice melted, it didn't just change the landscape, it deleted it. How many kingdoms, small, perhaps, but kingdoms nonetheless in the sense of organized human communities with culture and continuity, were lost to glacial melt? We'll never count them. The evidence is too scattered, too destroyed, but they were there. And they vanished as thoroughly as if they'd never existed. As the climate stabilized and human societies grew more complex, a pattern emerges across disparate cultures and continents. They looked up, not casually, not as we might glance at stars while walking at night, but systematically, obsessively. They tracked celestial movements with precision that sometimes rivals our own. Before dynastic Egypt, before Stonehenge's most famous phase, before the Mayan observatories, there were already skywatchers. We know this from alignments, from stone arrangements that serve no practical purpose unless they re-pointing at something specific on the horizon, from oral traditions that encode astronomical knowledge in myth and ritual. Why did they care? The practical answer is agriculture. Knowing the seasons precisely meant knowing when to plant, when to expect floods, when to prepare for drought. The stars didn't lie. They returned with absolute regularity. They were the most reliable thing in an unpredictable world. But there's a deeper answer, one harder to quantify. The sky was mystery and order simultaneously. It moved according to laws, but those laws were invisible, knowable only through patient observation over generations. To understand the stars was to touch something eternal, something that connected you to your ancestors and your descendants. These early astronomers didn't have telescopes or computers. They had their eyes, their minds, and time. Lots of time. Generations of observers noting where the sun rose and set throughout the year, where certain stars appeared on the horizon, how the moon's phases cycled. They created mental maps of the heavens more accurate than anything written down for millennia. And when they wanted to mark their knowledge permanently, they used stone. Megaliths aligned to solstices, burial mounds oriented to equinoxes, temple doorways that allowed light to penetrate only on specific days. These weren't decorative choices. They were declarations. We understand. We have watched. We know. Some researchers believe that before written language, astronomy might have been one of humanity's first sciences. Not science as we define it today, but science nonetheless systematic observation, prediction, testing against reality. The sky was their laboratory, and their findings, encoded in stone and myth, were their legacy. Centuries earlier, before metal, before writing, perhaps even before permanent cities, some cultures took their celestial knowledge even further. They didn't just track the sun and moon. They mapped stars. They recognized planets as distinct from fixed stars. They may have even understood precession, the slow wobble of Earth's axis that causes the position of stars to shift over millennia. This last point is controversial. Precession takes about 26,000 years to complete a full cycle. To notice it requires multi-generational observation and the ability to pass precise information across centuries. Yet some researchers argue that certain myths and monuments encode precession knowledge. The Egyptian concept of the Great Year, the Hindu yugas, the Mayan long count. These cyclical time systems measure periods suspiciously close to precessional cycles. Coincidence? Possibly. Or possibly the remnant of knowledge passed down from cultures that watched the skies long enough to notice that even the fixed stars eventually drift. Imagine such a culture, not literate, not urban, but obsessive in their observation. Each generation teaching the next exactly where certain stars rose, exactly which constellations were overhead at specific times. Over centuries, patterns would emerge. The elders would notice that their grandparents' star positions were slightly different from their own observations. This knowledge would be power. It would mark certain lineages or priesthoods as keepers of cosmic truth. It might justify social hierarchies, religious authority, or calendrical systems. And it would require an unbroken chain of transmission, something fragile, vulnerable to disruption by climate change, migration, or conquest. When such chains broke, as inevitably they must have, the knowledge would fragment. Perhaps pieces survived in myth stories about the sky being different in the ancient past, about gods moving the stars, about ages of the world that turned according to celestial rhythms. But the precision would be lost. We're left with monuments we can't fully explain, with myths that seem to reference astronomical concepts their supposed authors shouldn't have known, with the nagging sense that prehistoric people understood more about the cosmos than we give them credit for. They weren't primitives pointing at pretty lights. They were the first scientists, counting the heavens before anyone thought to write the numbers down. Here's an image to carry with you. A desert night 10,000 years ago. There are no cities anywhere on Earth bright enough to produce significant light pollution. No streetlights. No car headlights. The darkest modern wilderness can't match it. They altered the atmosphere itself with particulates and emissions that scatter light. But back then, on a moonless night far from any fire, the darkness was total. And within that darkness, the stars blazed with an intensity we've collectively forgotten. The Milky Way wasn't a faint smudge. It was a river of light, bright enough to cast actual shadows. Bright enough that you could walk by starlight alone, your own silhouette faintly visible on the ground beneath you. Venus at its brightest could cast shadows too. Even individual stars like Sirius would contribute noticeable light. Ancient texts occasionally reference this. Egyptian writings describe nighttime temple ceremonies where priests could perform rituals by starlight. Aboriginal Australian traditions speak of navigating by star glow. Greek philosophers mention reading by the light of Venus. We've lost this. Not just the light itself, but the relationship with darkness it enabled. Modern humans fear true darkness. We illuminate everything. We've forgotten that night has its own light, subtle, ancient, profound. Those prehistoric astronomers didn't need instruments to see the sky deeply. It was simply there, vivid and unavoidable. Every night was an observatory. Every open space was a planetarium. The stars were as much a part of their daily reality as the sun. And so when they built monuments aligned to celestial events, they weren't commemorating something abstract or distant. They were honoring companions, points of light that had guided their ancestors, that marked their seasons, that told them where they were in time. The stars cast shadows then, real, visible shadows. And in those shadows, ancient people walked, carrying knowledge we're only now beginning to recover. But another transformation continued, quieter than floods, but more permanent. The seas kept rising, not catastrophically, not after the major meltwater pulses ended, but steadily. A few millimeters per year, perhaps. Across centuries, across millennia, those millimeters became meters. Coastlines retreated. Harbors became open water. Islands were cut off from mainlands. River deltas advanced seaward, burying earlier settlements under thick sediment. And humanity ever adaptable, simply moved, rebuilt farther inland, forgot what had been. But the archaeological record doesn't forget. It just hides it very well beneath mud and salt water. Recent technology has begun to reveal what was lost. Multi-beam sonar can map underwater landscapes with precision. Submersibles can navigate submerged sites. Ground-penetrating radar works through water in some conditions. What we're finding is humbling. Off the coast of India, near Gujarat, sonar surveys revealed geometric patterns on the seabed, straight lines, right angles, structures that don't occur naturally. Dating is difficult underwater, but the depth suggests these structures have been submerged for thousands of years. Off Japan, the Yanaguni Monument remains controversial. Is it natural geological formation or worked by human hands? Researchers are divided, but even the skeptics admit that if it is natural, it's an extraordinary coincidence that it resembles terraced architecture so closely. In the Mediterranean, dozens of submerged settlements have been confirmed. Some are merely drowned villages. Others hint at larger complexity, stone foundations, harbor works, possible temples or public buildings. Each discovery pushes the question further. What are we missing? What's still down there? The challenge is scale. Oceans cover 70% of Earth's surface. Even shallow continental shelf regions, where prehistoric humans would most likely have lived, represent vast areas, most of which have never been surveyed with modern equipment. It's like trying to find specific houses in a city the size of Asia, but the city is underwater, and you have to map it essentially blind. Statistically, the majority of human coastal settlements from before 8,000 years ago are now submerged. We will never find most of them. They're simply gone, degraded by currents, buried by sediment, scattered by storms. But some remain. And every time we find one, it confirms what should be obvious. People lived on coasts, and when the coasts moved, their homes were lost. Meanwhile, the continental shelves hold secrets of a different order. These aren't just drowned ports or coastal villages. These are entire landscapes, plains, valleys, river systems now completely underwater. During the Ice Age, they were habitable land, possibly prime habitable land, with moderate climates and abundant resources. Doggerland, connecting Britain to Europe, might have supported large populations. It was flat, well-watered, and positioned between major regions. It would have been a crossroads, a place where ideas and genes mixed. And now it's beneath the North Sea, accessible only to fishing trawlers that occasionally dredge up Mesolithic tools and mammoth bones. The Persian Gulf was largely dry land during the last glacial maximum. The Tigris and Euphrates rivers merged into a single waterway that flowed through a long valley before emptying into the ocean much farther south than today. People would have lived in that valley. They would have fished its river, hunted its banks, maybe built villages that we now classify as the origin of Mesopotamian civilization. But their precursors, the actual origin, might be underwater at the head of the Gulf, buried under meters of sediment. Southeast Asia's Sunda Shelf connected what are now islands into a massive subcontinent called Sundaland. It was enormous, bigger than India, and for tens of thousands of years, it was home to human populations whose genetic traces we find throughout the region. What did they build? What cultures did they develop? We don't know. The ocean took it all when the ice melted. These weren't marginal lands. They were prime real estate. Coastal, well-watered, accessible. The very qualities that made them attractive to ancient people also made them vulnerable to sea level rise. And so the most successful kingdoms, if we can call them that, of the pre-agricultural world, might now be completely inaccessible, locked under continental shelves where excavation is currently impossible. It's a sobering thought. The idea that the majority of human prehistory happened in places we literally cannot reach with our current technology. That the civilizations recovered on land might be outliers, the ones that happen to be in high elevation, away from coasts, in the minority of locations that weren't dramatically altered by climate change. The ghost kingdoms of the continental shelves will remain ghostly for the foreseeable future, but they were real, and their absence from our history books is a matter of geography, not importance. As we sift through these fragments of deep history, one question recurs with uncomfortable persistence. How? How did people without metal tools move 100-ton stones? How did they align monuments to celestial events with precision we struggle to match with modern instruments? How did they accomplish feats of engineering that we genuinely don't understand? The mainstream answer is human ingenuity, time, and lots of labor. This is probably correct: no aliens or lost super technologies required. But it also glosses over how sophisticated that ingenuity must have been. Primitive people weren't primitive. They were us, same brains, same creativity, just different circumstances. Consider the moving of megaliths. We assume rollers, levers, sledges. Experiments have shown these techniques work. But the precision placement fitting stones together so tightly that a blade won't fit between them, aligning them to true north within fractions of a degree, this requires knowledge we can demonstrate, but can T fully explain the transmission of. Someone figured it out first, then taught others. The knowledge spread, adapted, improved. Maybe certain families or guilds held the secrets, passing the master to apprentice across generations. And if that chain broke, if a civilization collapsed before the knowledge could be recorded, then later, peoples would look at the monuments left behind and wonder, how? We're in that position now, looking at Göbekli Tepe, at Puma Punku, at the precision stonework of early Egypt, and asking how. Not because it was impossible, but because the specific techniques weren't written down. They were in people's heads, in practiced hands, in traditions maintained through apprenticeship and practice. These forgotten engineers were brilliant. They understood materials, forces, geometry, and astronomy. They solved problems that took them years or decades, but left results that have lasted millennia. And then they died, and most of their knowledge died with them. Some survived, some was rediscovered, but much was simply lost, leaving us to reverse engineer their accomplishments from the artifacts alone. It's humbling, and it should make us wonder, what are we building now that will perplex future archaeologists? What knowledge do we assume is permanent that might vanish if our own civilizations stumble? But step back from the technical questions, from the how and when and where. Step back and feel the weight of all these lost kingdoms together. They existed. Thousands of cultures, spanning tens of thousands of years, each one as real to its inhabitants as your own world is to you. They had children who laughed, artists who struggled to capture beauty in stone or ochre, old people who told stories of even older times, lovers who met in secret, leaders who made decisions that shaped their communities, conflicts, resolutions, triumphs, tragedies. The full weight of human experience, repeated in endless variation. And now they're whispers, less than whispers implications. Shadows cast by ruins, hints left in DNA, question marks in geological surveys. Some nights, if you're quiet, if you're in the right place, a desert beneath stars, a coastline at dawn, a forest where megaliths sleep beneath moss, you might feel something. Not ghosts, not literally, but presence. The sense that this place remembers, even if you don't. That the ground beneath you has stories it could tell, if only it had voice. Indigenous cultures often speak of this. The land holding memory. Places where ancestors walked being sacred not just metaphorically, but actually the memory physically present, encoded in landscape and legend. Western archaeology is only now beginning to understand what this might mean in practical terms. How oral traditions can preserve genuine historical information. How landscape itself can be read as text. The lost kingdoms whisper through these remnants, through stones placed with purpose, through myths that encode real events, Through DNA that shows us migrations and mixings we had no other way to detect. Through isotopes in ancient bones that tell us what people ate, where they traveled, when they died. Each whisper is faint. Alone it might be dismissed. But together they form a chorus. And if you really listen, you begin to hear the outline of something vast. A human story that doesn't start with Sumer or Egypt or China. A story that starts 100,000 years ago, maybe more, and includes countless chapters we've only just begun to recover. These kingdoms lived fully. They deserve to be remembered, even if we can never know their names. So now, as this journey draws to its close, let yourself drift. You're standing in a desert, but it's not empty. Not really. Beneath the sand, invisible but present, are the foundations of homes. The pottery shards of meals eaten 8,000 years ago. The grinding stones where grain was prepared. The hearths where families gathered as night fell. Picture the city at twilight. Not this city, not any city you've seen, but one that existed before history, on a coastline now drowned, in a climate now extinct. The air is mild. The stars are beginning to appear. So many stars, brighter than you've ever seen. People move through streets you can't quite focus on. They speak a language that was never written, never recorded, never heard by modern ears. They don't know they're lost. To them, this is now. This is real. This is permanent. They have every expectation that their children's children's children will walk these same streets, speak these same words, honor these same gods. They're wrong, but they have no way to know it. The sea will rise, or the rain will fail, or the ice will come, or the rivers will shift. And in a few centuries, or perhaps just a few decades, this place will be abandoned. The desert will cover it. The ocean will swallow it. Time will erase it so thoroughly that even myths will forget. But right now, in this twilight moment before history begins, they're here. And they're human, exactly as you are. They love and fear and hope and dream. They look at the stars and wonder. They tell stories about where they came from and where they're going. And if you're very quiet, if you let yourself fall into that space between waking and sleep, you might walk among them. Not physically, you're still here, still now, but in that part of consciousness that reaches backward, that recognizes something in the ruins and the silence. The part that knows, instinctively, that you're not the first, that others came before, that they built kingdoms from dust and will, and those kingdoms fell, and the dust remains. The desert wind shifts. The stars wheel overhead, the same stars they watched. And somewhere beneath your feet, or beneath the sea, or beneath the ice, those kingdoms sleep. Forgotten, yes, but once they were everything. If you found peace in this journey through lost time, if these whispers of ancient kingdoms helped quiet your modern world, consider returning. There are other ruins to explore, other silences to sit with, other forgotten peoples who deserve at least to be remembered in dreams. But for now, let the darkness hold you. Let the stars cast their ancient shadows, and rest knowing that someday, perhaps soon, perhaps in millennia, your own world will become someone else's mystery. Your own cities will be ruins that future peoples marvel at, asking how and why and who. The kingdoms are lost, but the night remains. And in the night, beneath stars unchanged, we're all connected past, present, and future by the simple fact that we looked up, wondered, and tried to leave something behind that would last. Sleep well, traveler. The forgotten kingdoms welcome you, and they'll be here, waiting in silence whenever you return.